Okay. So I thought it might make some sense to set the stage for today to tell a brief anecdote about some of my earlier teenage years. So I was about 13 or 14 years old, I'd say, returning to Canada from living in the Caribbean for several years. And I was enrolled in a grade 8 classroom in a predominantly white school in Pickering. Durham wasn't back then what it's like now. It was mostly swampland and not a ton of diversity. I was also an Afro-Caribbean immigrant in the early 90s, had an accent, friends at school. And I remember this one boy, and we're going to call him Sammy for now. And Sammy used to call me the N-word and other names. And on one occasion, Sammy physically assaulted me. I'm dating myself a little bit now, but he gave me a DDT, which is a wrestling analogy, on top of a stone in the yard at school. And I'd say it was around this time that I first started noticing my social anxiety. I definitely had anxious tendencies before that, but I would say that my concerns with self-evaluation and being ridiculed, embarrassed by others really started getting worse around this time. And it probably sparked about a 10 to 15 year untreated battle with social anxiety for me. In some ways now, this is a timely story because this week is Bullying Awareness and Prevention Week in many of our school boards across Ontario. So students are going to be learning about bullying, its impact, et cetera, and trying to address this very important issue. And we have decades of literature now on the nefarious impacts of bullying on children and youth. And I'm not here to recount all of that with you, but we do know more now about how childhood bullying and victimization of children have impacted self-esteem, depression, anxiety, panic, led to academic failure, suicidality, self-injury. And longitudinal studies suggest that these impacts are really quite long-standing and can last into young adulthood. So, how do I get from having some crappy life experiences to struggling with social anxiety for years and years? And I would argue that it wasn't the maltreatment itself, but rather it was the internalization of those experiences for me. It was the bullying turned inward that hurt the most and was most hurtful. The self-bully within me, the self-critic that developed over years that really kept those lousy feelings around. And it's our self-bullying also that's most silent. It's the thing that people don't see often. And it's also the thing that's less likely to be a topic of conversation over the next week as our kids go to school and discuss bullying. It's that self-bullying that takes our pain, which is unavoidable in life, and actually starts to transform it into suffering. So, pain is unavoidable, but suffering is actually optional. Suffering is experiencing pain, but burying your head in the sand around it, doing something ineffective to try to fix it, to escape it, to avoid it. Pain times avoidance equals suffering. And when our avoidance goes to zero, we can still have pain in our lives, but we don't suffer in quite the same way. So if you think about this, how many times in your own life have you been stuck with some avoidable situation, something you didn't ask for, but it's happening to you anyways, and it might be causing you some pain, like being bullied, for example. But we do things to exacerbate the pain, like blame ourselves, tell ourselves that we're no good, ugly, never be accepted, that we're unlovable in some way. That's the kind of place that my 14-year-old self was, bringing myself more psychological pain. But I was also really avoidant. And so I didn't confront any of that pain. Those strong emotions I avoided. I learned lots of creative ways of avoidance as I got older, telling myself it didn't matter, that my social avoidance was just because I didn't like people and that other people were stupid. I, developed this sort of, at least what I thought was this really cool kind of like F the world attitude to shield me from some social exposure. And, inadvertently, what I was doing is I was keeping my avoidance high, and it just contributed to more suffering and prolonged it. So right now you might be asking yourselves, well, Kofi, we came to hear you talk about self-compassion in kids. And so why is the first thing out of your mouth related to bullying and self-bullying and how you suffered as a kid? Well, in part, it's because it's impossible to discuss self-compassion without talking about compassion, of course. And it's impossible to discuss compassion without discussing what we need to extend our best wishes for gentleness and compassion towards our suffering. So the starting block, as sad and miserable a topic as it might seem, is understanding our suffering better. We can't have compassion without suffering. And our kids suffer. I mean, the challenges that they face now are so different from the ones that we faced when we were younger. They've got Instagram, Snapchat, Twitter, TikTok. And now there are other social platforms that I know absolutely nothing about and scare me half to death, like stuff like Discord. No understanding of these things. And our kids are dealing with COVID. Some of them have missed like 2 years of in-person education. And they have so much adult-related content just right there at their fingertips and contend with the misuse of social media every day. And they avoid, especially our teenagers, smoking too much weed, it's avoidance. Getting drunk at parties, it's avoidance. Younger kids crumpling up their tests and saying this is stupid, avoidance. Not getting out of bed to go to school, avoidance. And all of this adds to their suffering. The problems or emotions they're avoiding don't just go away. They're like crying babies that are unattended to. They just cry louder and louder and louder until they get their needs met. So let's talk a little bit about self-compassion with the backdrop of thinking about suffering. Self-compassion is not different from compassion. It's our efforts to be kind and gentle towards our suffering. It's our wishing that a person be free from that suffering. It's joining with that person in their suffering, recognizing when someone's in pain and abandoning our fear or resistance to it and allowing a natural feeling of love and kindness to be directed towards that individual. And it just so happens that with self-compassion, that individual is you. It's giving the same kindness to ourselves that we would give to someone we love when they need it the most. Self-compassion is a form of acceptance. It's the acceptance of ourselves while we're in pain. Acceptance is more about what's happening to us, of course. It's like accepting a feeling or a thought, but self-compassion is actually about the person. And it can be our antidote to suffering. So essentially, self-compassion can be comprised of 3 things, or we can think about it in 3 ways, which we don't have an extensive amount of time to get into, but we'll touch base on each one of them briefly. So one is mindfulness. That's like no longer hiding from our negatively valenced emotions, no longer hiding from our pain. 2, self-compassion is all about having some self-kindness. It's treating ourselves in a way that we wish someone who we care deeply about would be treated. And thirdly, it's understanding that there's a common humanity that others share in this pain, that it's not unique to us. So if you were a child, for example, and you cut your finger, you would mindfully attend to it. Right? You'd say, ouch, out loud. You stick that finger in your mouth. You'd go tell your parent or caregiver and share that painful moment with them. So essentially, you were mindful, you showed self-kindness, and you demonstrated an understanding of some common humanity around it. This is how we treat our physical pain. But it's such a rarity when it comes to our emotional pain. So to explain how self-compassion works a little bit more, I'm going to introduce you to 3 clients in my practice. I'm going to introduce you to Anna, John, and Peter. Okay. So Anna Anna learned to be more self-compassionate through mindfulness. This is the basis for the rest of self-compassion in a lot of ways. Anna was a 16-year-old client of mine who I saw on throughout her high school years and was working on social. For those of you who are less familiar, social anxiety is essentially fear that's related to social judgment, humility or rejection, or some anxiety with respect to performance or performance settings. And Anna had all of this in spades, and it caused her a lot of pain in her life. And Anna had this thing also where she spoke so negatively about her anxiety. She hated it. And she hated herself for being so anxious. And she really had an unhealthy relationship with her anxiety. And I swear, if she could find a way, she would just cut her anxiety right out of her mind and her body. So we tried some behaviorally based treatments to manage her anxiety. And this involved doing something that we call exposures, which is putting Anna in situations that basically allowed her to face her social fears in a way that was safe. And the idea was that she would learn that these situations don't actually cause her the harm that she thinks that they cause, and that her body eventually will habituate or adjust to the fearful experiences that she's had in those environments. We also did a bunch of work on challenging some of her unhelpful thoughts that she had about herself and her anxiety. However, none of it really worked enough. It worked some, but not quite enough. So I got to thinking, well, what's really getting in the way here? And we turned our attention to this crappy relationship that she had with her emotions, which actually invited her anxiety to linger for a while longer and actually take up space in her body. And it occupied a lot of space, making itself extra comfortable. All of that effort to avoid it just made her anxiety grow bigger and bigger. Have you ever done that white elephant exercise? So let's pause for a moment, and I want you to take a moment and you're able to think about anything that you want, anything in the world, anything that comes to mind, but you're not allowed to think about the white elephant. So let's just take 20, 30 seconds and see if we can do that. Not think about the white elephant. So how did that go? I can imagine. I mean, in some ways, it's a bit of a setup because the reference point is the white elephant. So to not think about it means that you actually have to think about it. So virtually that activity is impossible. The point is that thoughts and feelings that we usually try to ignore typically come back with a vengeance. So instead of fighting these feelings, Anna and I had to actually work on something that seemed very paradoxical to her. We worked towards cozying up to and accepting some of those feelings, being more gentle with those feelings and with herself having less, and being more gentle with herself for having anxiety. But this first means that we had to acknowledge and let those feelings in. We had to get to know them better. Our emotions are sometimes experienced as so aversive that we spend most of our time trying to shut them out, shut them off, or shut them down in some kind of way. And we never get to learn that they might actually be helpful to us. Anna's anxiety wasn't really to be hated, it was to be celebrated in some ways. Now, sure, she had too much of it in moments that she didn't need it. But that's not necessarily an issue with the anxiety itself. That's more of an issue about her thinking and her interpretation of certain situations that generated that anxiety for her. Her anxiety itself helped with a bunch of stuff that she wasn't even aware of. It helped to prepare her for tests and exams. It helped her be cautious amongst peers who maybe didn't have her best interest. It helped her stay out of some social difficulties. Without anxiety, we would really essentially get very little done, especially not in a timely fashion. Without anxiety, I wouldn't have prepared for this presentation today. We need anxiety. It's our preparatory emotion, even though it doesn't feel good. So in keeping with self-compassion, rather than avoiding that part of us, Anna and I worked on accepting that part of who we are and embracing it. It's freeing. It reduces that shame and hiding behavior that can come with the things that sometimes we don't feel proud of. So Anna learned to accept through mindfulness. So what is mindfulness? Mindfulness is having full awareness of our thoughts, our feelings, our behavior. It's being in the moment. It's being in the here and now. In learning to be more mindful, Anna had to learn 3 things though. First, she had to learn to stop what she was doing. Just slow things down a little bit and take a moment to observe her anxiety, just as it is. And when she saw her mind drifting off, the act of being mindful was just gently, without judgment, returning her mind back to the present. And the present sometimes involved feeling anxious, which of course isn't pleasant. It wasn't pleasant for Anna. Anna needed to learn to experience her anxiety, but to experience it with a new framework attached. Within the midst of sort of mindful practice, or when she was noticing that hate towards her anxiety, we also worked on mantras to help. And one of them was a mantra that I use myself when I'm struggling to accept something. I don't like it. I can't change it. I accept it. I don't like it. I can't change it. I accept it. Turning her mind towards acceptance over and over. Look, we just spend a lot of time avoiding negative emotional states. Because they're aversive, we avoid them. But every feeling is natural, normal, and healthy, even the ones that don't feel good. Can you imagine the world for a moment without fear? We need it. It tells us that there's danger and gives us energy to avoid danger. So facing these emotions and becoming more comfortable with them was very important for Anna. Reducing our suffering behind this, though, requires us to sit with and acknowledge those emotions. The act of labeling emotions automatically gives us more mindful awareness and hence more control over those experiences. It's essential to us having more compassionate responses towards our pain. We stop, observe, return. And when we can do this with more general, gentle terms, like saying things to ourselves like, ouch, labeling those emotions by saying pleasant, unpleasant, neutral, this hurts. Or we can use more deliberate, more pointed language with feelings words, labeling it fear, that's worry, that's frustration, again, in gentle ways. And if we're feeling overwhelmed by those emotions, we can gently shift our attention between anchoring our feelings in our body, which is a mindful task that we might talk a little bit more about later, like focusing on our breathing when things become overwhelming. But we can focus by labeling emotions by saying and repeating the emotion, fear, 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 and then being gentle and tuning into it in a gentle and loving manner instead of in a self-critical way. So let's play a clip because I think it'll be useful at this point to talk a little bit more about the way in which Anna had to move towards accepting, but almost moving beyond accepting, almost befriending some of those feelings. And I love this poem by Rumi because it depicts this idea really well. And I think perhaps some of you may have seen it before. So I'm just going to stop sharing my screen for a moment and open up another window so we can watch that poem together.
This being human is a guest house. Every morning, a new arrival. A joy, a depression, a meanness. Some momentary awareness comes as an unexpected visitor. Welcome and entertain them all. Even if they're a crowd of sorrows who violently sweep your house empty of its furniture, still treat each guest honorably. He may be clearing you out for some new delight. The dark thought, the shame, the malice, meet them at the door laughing and invite them in. Be grateful for whoever comes, because each has been sent as a guide from beyond.
Okay. I just think that that's so pointed and well said. So, this might be a good moment for us to do a little bit of a mindfulness awareness activity that helps give a sense of the kind of mindful attunement and acceptance and understanding of our feelings that is necessary for us to begin to have a greater sense of self-compassion. So when we engage in mindfulness, I would ask that where you're seated, that you get yourself into a comfortable position. In the interest of time, we'll make this a short activity. Get into a position that you can hold for 2 to 3 minutes, preferably with your feet firmly planted against the ground, but something that you can feel comfortable with. And if you feel comfortable doing so, I'll ask that you close your eyes. If you don't feel comfortable closing your eyes, you can sort of just gaze at something in the screen in front of you. And most mindfulness activities and mindful practice starts with focusing on our breathing, in part because our breathing is always present and it's a great anchor in terms of focusing on things in our bodies to help us bring us into the current moment. Our breathing is also always current. So we're going to start by just focusing in and tuning into our breath. And we're just going to notice our breathing as it comes and goes. Not trying to change it. Not trying to make it any different. Just noticing. And what we're going to do is, if you feel comfortable doing so, just place your hand above your heart. And breathe through your heart. Sometimes it's helpful to just notice as that region of your body just rises and falls. And when you're ready, you can just let your hands slowly fall to your lap, keeping your attention in that heart region. And then silently ask yourself, what am I feeling right now? Maybe it's in relation to something in the workplace. Or maybe it's something related to a child you work with or care for. And you can just let your attention be drawn to the strongest emotion in your body. Even if it's just a whisper. And I ask you to give that strongest feeling a name. If you don't have a strong feeling, it's okay. Maybe it's just contentment. But if you search, you might find other emotions there. Longing, sadness, worry, anger. Repeat the label a few times. If the feeling's too strong, you can just turn your attention back to your breathing gently. And then move back and forth between the feeling and your breath in a relaxed way. Again, there's no need to find an emotion if there is none. Just be open to the possibility that there might be emotions there as you breathe. So I ask you gently bring your attention back to your breathing, just noticing as it comes and goes. Maybe noticing if it's warm or cool. And then if your eyes are being closed, I'll ask you gently reopen them. And then we'll return our attention back to the presentation. And as we return our attention back to our presentation, I'd ask that I know we're in a webinar setting here, but think about a non-judgmental observation that maybe you've made while in that practice. Just what you noticed. When we make the conscious choice to experience our painful thoughts and feelings just as they are, we suffer less. But it doesn't mean that pain isn't experienced in the moment. Again, we're hoping and helping to bring that avoidance in the equation that we looked at first back down to zero. Okay. So the second part to learn is to be more compassionate towards ourselves. We have mindfulness as the base, but the second part is learning to be more kind towards ourselves. And so I want to introduce you to a client that I had. His name was John. Well, maybe that name, but John. John is a 12-year-old boy who I used to see in my practice, who I diagnosed with disruptive mood dysregulation disorder, which basically just means that he's a bit of a super sensor, that he feels things more strongly than other kids, has some emotional outbursts, and has a slow return to baseline. But John also believed at his core that he was no good and that people will reject him as a result. He viewed himself as fundamentally flawed in some way. And some of this was this crappy interchange that he had between very critical social environments that he was in, like home and school, and his biology. He was born more emotionally sensitive and reactive. But John was just so incredibly hard on himself. He'd make mistakes at school, he'd bang his head against the desk or hit himself in the face. He'd say self-deprecating things, I'm so stupid, I'm a loser, and so on. So I set out with John trying to sort of reduce that self-critic who was barking all of these negative and awful things at him constantly. And so we did some traditional cognitive work together, challenging that negative thinking, providing him, supporting him with more positive self-talk, and it worked some. However, we didn't really start to make progress until he started to learn to detach from some of those thoughts, instead of fighting with them all the time. Now, we worked on learning that thoughts are just thoughts. And we literally have 75, 85,000 thoughts a day. They come and go. They're like clouds in the sky. Some of them are even below conscious awareness. And learning how to let go of our negative thinking and cultivate more non-attachment to them brought John more relief than any of the wrestling back and forth that we were doing about thoughts. And again, this was related to mindfulness because it required John to notice his negative thoughts, label them without judgment, and then turn himself mindfully back to the current moment. And in doing so, reducing his pain and suffering. And I like this clip because I think it very nicely expresses what we just talked about as well. So I'm going to pull up another clip for you here.
Hi, welcome to Being Mindful. I'm Susan. I'm a licensed mental health counselor.
Have you ever
And
noticed
I have
how
been practicing
easy it is
mindfulness
to get
meditation
pulled into
for
a
quite some time and really enjoy sharing practices?
struggle with your own thoughts and feelings? We all readily do this. It comes naturally to us. We start fighting and struggling with our own thoughts and feelings. It's as if we get pulled into this game of chess where we've got all our positive thoughts and feelings on one side of the board and all our negative thoughts and feelings on the other side. And we get so invested in trying to win this game. We move the positive thoughts and feelings across the board, hoping to dominate it, hoping to wipe out all the negative thoughts and feelings. But there are at least two problems of going through life this way. Firstly, there's an infinite number of positive and negative pieces. So this battle is never over, it's ongoing forever. The other problem is that positive pieces actually attract negative pieces. You move the positive piece, I'm a good friend, it attracts the negative piece, no you're not, what about the time you did that? You move the positive piece, I accept myself, It attracts the negative piece. No, you don't. What about your thighs? What about your stretch marks? What about your pot belly? So what if we could learn how to be like the board? The board's in intimate contact with the pieces, it makes a space for the pieces, but it's not involved in the fighting. If we can learn how to be more like the board, to step back and watch our thoughts and feelings, to let them come and go, to make space for them, without getting caught up in a fight or a struggle or conflict with them, we're in a much better space to build a rich and meaningful life, because we can invest our time and effort and energy in acting on our values and behaving like the sort of person we really want to be, instead of investing our precious energy in a futile struggle with our own thoughts and feelings.
So I think that really nicely captures, what John had to learn to do more, was to be more like the board, learning to let go. Okay. But John also had to learn some additional things, because self-kindness for him wasn't just about learning to let go of his self-critic. It was also about getting in touch with the things about himself that he loves, or discovering the things about himself that he loves. So there's a body of research on happiness. And they determined that happiness level is actually determined by three things. One is our happy genes, which they found in the body, which account for about 50% of our happiness. Two is circumstances, which I think we probably would have all assumed would have a higher number than 10%. And third is intentional activity, accounting for 40%. And this one being the most interesting to me, because it's also the one that we have most control over. So what does this mean? Well, with John, it meant helping him highlight the things that he valued in his life, which he'd probably gotten so far away from. And then working with him on re-engaging in intentional activities every day that were in alignment with those values. And this is more compassionate behavior towards ourselves. John had to take behavioral action to treat himself with compassion. And this didn't mean going and taking a bath or doing other self-care things. And it might for some, but it just didn't mean that for John. For John, this included mindfully attending to and engaging in activities that brought him value and purpose, quality relationships with friends, caring for animals, humor, things like that. And we worked towards him fully participating in a subset of activities that were related to those values every day, taking those moments in, savoring them, even those that seemed small or trivial. If the value was related to relationships and John said something kind to his sister that day, acknowledging and expressing gratitude for that was part of him exercising some compassion. And lastly, so we talked about mindfulness, we've talked about self-kindness, and lastly, there's a sense of common humanity which contributes to self-compassion. So I want to introduce you to Peter very quickly. So Peter is a 17-year-old client of mine who just didn't fit in, viewed himself as fundamentally different from others and highly misunderstood, thought that his depression was unique, that nobody understood him or his suffering, had a learning disability, struggled in school. The underachievement just led to more criticism in the classroom and at home. Relating to others is a form of self-care. And when something bad happens, we often isolate ourselves, feel alone with our pain. Some feelings that we harbor interfere with our ability to connect with others and interfere with our ability to have compassion for ourselves and others, for example, anger. Anger is a dominant but negatively valenced emotion, and it's a hard emotion. Its action tendencies are to push others away. Shame is a negative submissive emotion and, makes people hide. Disappointment leads to withdrawal. All of these emotions in excess can lead to disruption in our social relationships and to us having a lack of shared experience with others. For example, Peter, struggling at school, just hides all of his pain, hides it from his parents because he doesn't want to hear it from them, right? Doesn't want that added ridicule. So what happens next? Well, he hides all of that pain, starts hanging around people who he think might understand, who are maybe like-minded, but similarly kind of ostracized, some of whom are engaging in more delinquent kinds of things. And the next thing you know, Peter was in an alternative school placement. So look, part of the work with Peter was working on acknowledging some of these emotions that were leading to these action tendencies for him to remove himself. And fair enough, because peers hadn't exactly been kind to him. And, obviously we needed to work more on some self-acceptance, similar to the work with John. However, Peter also needed to learn that he was not alone with his pain. Connecting with others who would be validating to his experience of the world, working with the school on engaging him in values and pursuits that, he was good at and interested in, the arts. He participated in the development of a youth hub in the community that he was from. He got engaged with a band. All of this helped to build some of his own self-acceptance and started to get him connected with others who might understand him and who shared some of his values. Therapy would have also been a good thing for Peter, normalizing some of the experiences he had and helping to reduce some of the stigma that was related to his mental health and creating more suffering for him in his life. So in closing, I know we're short on time here. We've, heard about John and Anna and Peter, but in the spirit of self-compassion, I was thinking again about my 14-year-old self and what I would have wished for him. I would have wished he had a big hug and someone to tell him in those moments to be gentle with himself. And I wish he'd learned some more skills to be more self-compassionate. And it's interesting too, I have gratitude for those experiences that he went through today, even the ones that caused pain, because so much was learned from experiencing all of that anxiety when I was younger. And there's a form of mindfulness that's related to self-compassion. It's called loving kindness. We don't have a ton of time to practice loving kindness and get into that today. But I would encourage all of you on the call to look into it if you don't already practice it or if you're not already engaged in mindful meditative practice. If we're harboring lots of feelings of judgment and self-hate and just harshness and criticism towards ourselves, loving kindness and beginning our days with some loving kindness can be really impactful, can be really helpful. And the practices are very similar to the ones that we did earlier, but the mantra changes. There's a mantra with loving kindness that you can use that I think is really impactful and powerful for me, and it's helped me a lot. And part of what I repeat in that mindful practice is, let me be happy, let me be well, and may I have peace. And I extend that to myself, but you can also extend that to others in your life. Maybe we extend that to folks who we've been struggling with and expressing some loving kindness towards them. And always remembering when you're practicing loving kindness that the intentionality behind it is more important than the words itself. It's extending that kindness and that gentleness towards ourselves. It's remembering that we're not trying to achieve any particular outcome other than expressing and extending that kindness towards ourselves. So again, I wish we had some time to be able to engage in that practice together today. But in the interest of time, I think we should probably stop there and welcome any questions.
Thanks so much for that, Kofi. It was great. I think showing the 3 examples of people in your practice and how they engaged in mindfulness and self-compassion really helps folks to engage in it in their own lives as well. So if anybody has any questions, please feel free to add them into the question and answer option. Somebody's asking about sharing the recording. Yes, we'll be sharing the recording following the session. Do you have any questions for Kofi about techniques or any additions to the stories? How can we be more like the board?
Yeah, that requires practice, being more like the board. And I can't say that I am more like the board. I'm definitely no expert, and I get caught up in all of my emotions and connectivity to outcomes all of the time, right? And learning to let go of our thoughts and our self-criticism and our judgments is really challenging. And I think, it requires mindful practice. I would say that the best way to go about learning to let go is first labeling and noticing that we are wrestling with our thinking. It's so much of the time we are involved in self-bullying kinds of activities and we have no idea until it's too late, where we feel beat up, beat down, or we're in our workplaces and we're feeling burnt out. And the slowing of the process and the noticing comes first, I would say. And then learning to exercise what we call like cultivating non-attachment, letting go of those thoughts, and then returning our minds back to the current moment is sort of the critical piece, and it requires some practice. So if you think about a child sitting in a classroom and they're saying something happened over recess, and they're saying all of these negative things towards themselves, well, step one is actually noticing that they're saying these negative things towards themselves. And then once you were able to start noticing that, we can gently start to turn our attention back to the current moment. Back to the current moment, because what's happening in the here and now? Well, the teacher's teaching, right? And we're missing all of that because we're so caught up in all these negative judgments about ourselves. So it does take some time and some practice to become more like the board. But I do love that analogy.
And then how would you suggest parents or educators or other child serving folks encourage discussion with children and youth who are apprehensive to talk?
Yeah, I'm reminded of a movie that one of my favorite movies, Boys in the Hood. It's an old one. I don't know if you guys have seen it, but one of my favorite movies. There's a scene where Lawrence Fishburne is trying to talk to the main character, which is his son, about an issue. And his son's about to open up to him about all the stuff that's happening in his life. And he launches in with a bunch of stuff that's like, are you being careful? And all this safety related stuff. And because as parents and as caregivers, often we're trying to fix something. And if I were to give any advice, most situations, even with kids, they often don't require fixing, or they're not looking for us to fix a situation. They usually get more hung up in the process and staying process related with our kids and focusing first on some validation before we offer something with respect to change might help them open up a little bit more and might help them feel good about communicating and expressing themselves and how they'd be feeling. So I would validate attunement before we try to engage in any change-based strategies, is what I would say. And over time, kids will become more comfortable.
Awesome, thanks. And I think we have time for one more question. So how would you suggest folks help kids engage with these strategies?
Well, I think at schools are doing some really interesting stuff lately. I find so many schools are doing innovative things, right? Introducing mindfulness into their classrooms, having mindful moments, mindful walking, like, some really cool stuff. Yoga in some schools, in some classrooms. And so at the school level, I think some interesting things are already starting to occur as schools become more psychologically minded and pay more attention to mental health with kids. So I'd say, that's one thing. I think that the teachers and teachers in the call are in unique positions where you probably see kids being really highly critical with themselves all too often, right? And there's a fine line between, I think, like engaging in what would be like therapeutic practice with them and trying to, keep them safe. But I think being a caring, concerned ear as a teacher is something that would be a starting point. And often I ask the question in brief circumstances with kids that are being really cruel to themselves is like, what would you say to a friend in a situation like this? Being so hard on yourself. If a friend came to you and told you all of these things, what would you say to them? And why don't we try for a moment just to extend a little bit of that kindness towards yourself? And then, of course, there's lots of really cool stuff you can do at home with your children around mindfulness and mindful acceptance. And certainly we can think about some resources and send out some resources to families after for you if you're interested in some of that.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm sure folks would definitely be interested. Thank you, Kofi. Thanks for your time. Thanks for your expertise. Thanks for your wonderful storytelling. Just thank you. I'm sure everybody was very appreciative of the session today. So thanks, everyone. Have a wonderful rest of your day. And yeah, we'll send out the recording and resources to follow.
Thanks, everyone, for your attention.
Bye. Thank you.